Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, where we hear from some of the most relevant, up-to-date, informational speakers in our industry. In episode 29, Corey Wilness, President, Crop Pro Consulting, tells his story. SWAT maps, making variable rate great again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Crop Pro Corey on Twitter. If you want to tweet anything out, I'm always up for a good debate. I guess she just said all that. We do have a booth in the hall right next to here, so if you're interested in talking to our staff after, feel free. We do have an app that we use, our staff use with all our customers, called croprecords.com. If you want to check it out, you just go to the website. It's free for farmers. And also on our website on croppro.ca, our prices are all on there, so if after the session you're interested to know what our prices are, feel free. And although we're promoting ourselves as Crop Pro, we work with a lot of other independent consultants. We have field-to-field agronomy and then terra agronomy in the south over here. And so if you're a consultant looking to utilize some of these services, feel free to look there. So my talk today is about variable rate fertilizer and seed, and just the two fundamental principles to get the right rate in the right zone. Number one is you have to have the right zone map. The most important thing is to have a map that represents the field. If you don't have a map that represents the field and puts the areas together with fertilizer response characteristics, then you don't have a good starting point and you can't get to number two. Okay, so most of the presentation I'm going to spend about just on topic number one and how important it is to get the zone maps right. So what's the starting point? What should you do? Most people say, oh, you need to collect data, and everyone's been collecting data for 20 years and they've still done nothing with the data that they've collected. So I don't use that as my starting point. I use the same starting point as a renowned soil scientist from Saskatchewan, Les Henry. And this is out of his article in the Grain News about a year ago called Precision Ag May Not Work on Your Farm. These are the types of things that he mentions in his article: topography, soils, electrical conductivity, and in the end, it's all about water. So I agree with Les, and I feel that fertility-based variability is based on these things. So this is the basics of how we want to build our maps. Fertilizer response variability is most related to these three things. So on your soils themselves, you got your topsoil depth. Your hills might have a topsoil depth of this. Depressions might be like that. That relates to how much organic matter is in those. You can have different textures. You can have salinity. This all influences how the crop grows in the field. Water, we clearly understand where it's running off, shedding areas that are collecting water. And these things are all interrelated, right? Topography, I mean, if you have a hill, it's probably had historical erosion, wind and water erosion, has a thin topsoil, then it sheds water. These things are all interrelated. So how does it relate to fertility? Well, as far as nitrogen mineralization, or nitrogen that's just released from your soil on its own, these eroded hilltops have very little topsoil. It's very low organic matter. This topsoil's all ended up down into here. You got a high percent organic matter down there, and it's probably that deep. So how much nitrogen release is this going to release on its own? Next to nothing. Probably a fair amount, probably a lot. Right? That's how fertility just varies naturally out there in the field. And nitrogen mineralization this is not something new. People always, oh, we need to do more testing on variable rate. We need to do more testing. Well, some of these things have already been tested long, long ago. Ross McKenzie from Alberta Agriculture. Here's your increase in soil organic matter. Here's your increase in nitrogen release from the soil. Nice correlation there. This is not rocket science. Sulfur is a very interesting one. Sulfur also relates to mineralization from organic matter. They're both very organic processes. But when you go out and soil test sulfur, and you get your soil test back, sulfate sulfur, you'll find 99.9% of the time you have this trend. These areas that have low organic matter, they shed water, they always test low in sulfur. Okay, the areas that collect water and have high organic matter always test high in sulfur. 99.9% of the time. That's the way it is. Phosphorus, probably only 70 or 80% of the time it would follow this same trend, where these areas like sulfur or phosphorus is about 50% organic, 50% inorganic. So it's also still related to the organic part of the having topsoil, and the topsoil that blew off here took your phosphorus as well. So this is fairly similar. The only time that these areas tend to come up a lot in phosphorus is if they're very more sandy or have been very unproductive for a long period of time. Well, you can see how this all relates to water. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. So here's a good Twitter poll. If you like Twitter polls, I put these out quite often. That's fertility-based response characteristics. I showed them to you for this field. So how would you soil test a field? So here's my question. How do nutrients vary in a field? How should you soil test? 252 voters, 78% say soil, water, and topography. Well, 90+% of the industry is doing it this way. Okay? So if this is the way to do it, why don't we do it this way? It seems to be what people think is the way it should be done. So this is what we've been doing now this will be our 11th year. We've only been in Manitoba for 2 years now. Soil, water, and topography maps. We developed and commercialized it. We patented it. How do we build the maps? We have 6 of these trucks with RTK GPS. We've had various machines. We've been pulling EM38s. And now we have this machine called the topsoil mapper. This is collecting high-grade elevation. This is collecting electrical conductivity. And I see that they give us first place in the innovation showcase, which I'm very grateful for. Thank you, Manitoba Ag Days, for that. This is something new that we're commercializing this year. You can understand the cost and maintenance and labor to beat trucks over fields for the last 10 years. So what we've developed is what we call a SWAT box. And we've been testing a few different versions of this. Won't go quite like that. Those are our test units where we have electrical conductivity mapping that's going to be attached straight to people's implements like air drills, harrow bars, air carts. And now this enables us to use people's LiDAR. So if you have very good LiDAR, which basically the whole province of Alberta has done, and a lot of Manitoba is already done. So it's very accurate elevations done with a plane. Or if people already collected it with a drone, for example, we could use that elevation data, and then you could just attach this to your own truck or implement. And it collects and sends the data right to our web server. Here's our zone legend. Basically go out from red to yellow to green. These are what I call high and dry soils. These are sort of your mid-slope and field average soils. These are water collection areas, peats, salinities. And David Lobb, he spoke this morning. I watched his presentation. He did a fantastic job. Here's just his little schematic here of the green line is what the soils would have been naturally. And due to erosion, you see we lost a lot of topsoil and it's ended up down in here. And so it's just sort of a transect of what a soil would look like. And this is what we see out in the field, right? So we'd call this a zone 1. This whole area up here, and then as you go down, zone 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the wettest spot would be 10. Again, David Lobb's slide here showing the same thing. We would put these all together as a 1, and those hills would be a 1, so we'd manage them all together. That's what I'm calling a zone. All the areas in the field that are your deepest, blackest soils in here would all be a 10, and they'd all be sampled together, and they'd all be managed together. Okay? So my example field is from Wadena. So this is electrical conductivity map. So the red is the low readings, And then as you go up into here, you get some very high readings. So what the electrical conductivity is measuring is soil textures, soil salt levels, and salinity. And it's also a very good water map. Whatever's dissolved in water, you could call it a salt. I like to call them solutes because farmers tend to think of salts are bad, and yet you pay $500 a ton for a load of salt, right? And put it on the field, nitrogen, phosphorus. So salts aren't all bad. You can see the clear correlation in this field with all the high and dry land, areas that's shedding water, low electrical conductivity. Well, it's got low water, low solutes in it. You can see the water started where the water's collecting, where the solutes are collecting. And then these areas in here, the blue and purple, is salinity. Okay, so that's electrical conductivity map. This is from Pilot Mound, just showing you how we use these layers. This is from Henry's Handbook here, showing a bathtub ring salinity, where you have a slough in the middle. And the slough isn't saline, but it's highly leached, and the water goes in here, and then you have evaporative ring, so the water evaporates on the edge of the slough, and then you have salinity on the sides of your drainage ditches or the sides of your sloughs. So this is like 50 acres. It's a very large one. Down by Pilot Mound, you can see the center of the slough here, all the flow accumulations of water, and it's all running out here. This is all just nice deep black soil, and all around this slough is a bathtub ring salinity. That's an example of how you'd use that map. Here's our RTK elevation. Now the interesting thing with elevation is that 95% of people don't really understand that you can't use elevation on its own. Elevation on its own knows nothing about where water is. Okay, for example, up here, here's a bunch of hills. You can see them in the center here. This will grow cattails in a wet year. It's a water collecting basin. It's green. It's elevation about 1742. Look down at this end of the field. Tops of these hills are all green. Same elevation, right? Tops of hills, water shedding areas. That's a depression. So elevation itself doesn't know if an area collects water or sheds water. You have to have topography modeling software for this. Okay, so never use elevation on its own in any zone making process. Here's just an example of how good our water modeling is. You can see it over top of Google Earth on this field. And this doesn't show up very well, but it's the same map of the flow accumulations, and all these spots here are all areas that are holding water and collecting. And so the farmer put that in his John Deere Surface Water Pro. In the background, he drives to this spot here, drives all along the area that he needs to cut, and then it'll automatically cut the ditch to the length that he needs to. Okay, so that's how we model water, and you can clearly see how we would use this. So I showed you these two layers, electrical conductivity and RTK elevation, and now I'm going to show you how we turn that into a zone map. So here's my zone map for this field. Now you can see up here, remember I said that these were water collection areas, so you've got them zoned out in like a zone 8 or 9. All the salinity in this field is a zone 10, all by itself, so we're managing all the salinity together in a zone 10. Whenever your soil testing to zone 10, it's all salinity. This is light salinity. This is your field average soil, and as you go up to here, it's your high and dry soils. You can see these sort of lighter water shedding areas in here. Process called ground truthing, probably the process that's done the least, I think, in our industry, and it should be done the most. When you build maps, you got to go out to the field and make sure they represent the field. When I drive to the tops of these hills with my map loaded up in GPS, here I am showing you these spots on the map. If I drive to the top of this hill and it says I'm in a zone 10, what am I going to say? This map is wrong, right? I can't use this map. There's something we've made a mistake. Right? So that's how it would work. You can see the drone shot here. Doesn't look that good, but I mean, you can still see all these red areas, and the point I'm trying to make is that they're all sort of showing up together on the map. Here's the salinity. So whenever you drive to these spots in the field, it should be an exactly right spot, should be the same shape. That's what a good zone map looks like. Here's a shot from the drone here. So I mean, it's kind of hard to see, but this little corner here where we've got it mapped out, and then here it is right here. So if you want to put 0 fertilizer on your salinity, I can do that with my map. When the tractor's driving through here, we would get the prescription to say 0, and we'd shut off here and put on something here, and 0 here, and you see how it works there. This is a 24-inch core from this field. So here's from the zone 1, top of a hill, and it's only got about 4 inches of nice black topsoil, and after that, it's pretty much like subsoil. Here's the zone 8, non-saline depression, and we got about 16 inches of nice black dirt there. So you can see how the fertility matches the soil, water, and topography, right, and how it relates. Most of the industry likes to do it the easy way, with biomass and yield maps. This is all easily collected data, okay? Collecting data for soil, water, and topography maps is very difficult, very time-consuming and expensive, slow. So I'm going through this part pretty quick because I don't want to talk too much about it. We used a drone here. We have 8 years of correlated satellite imagery, and we're building a yield potential map over here. And this is a good yield potential map from this field. So most of the high yields in this land kind of comes out of the mid-slopes. You can kind of picture that here. Salinity and water collecting areas tend to either flood out or, of course, always be saline. So they're low yielding. But you notice in the medium yielding stuff, you've got tops of hills, and then you've got some of these areas around these potholes and stuff. This is one of the primary issues we have of using yield potential maps as zone maps, is you see it puts things together that shouldn't be together. The tops of these hills should not be grouped with these areas that are collecting water, okay? Just, that's not how fertility works. Same thing, you can go to the field and ground truth these maps. So this is one from those pictures I had, was a winter wheat year. You can see 2008 July image. So what I've got here is low biomass in this spot. So this is my yield potential map. Here's my soil, water, and topography map. Low biomass, saline depression. Low biomass, top of a hill. Low biomass, top of a hill. Low biomass, saline depression. So I don't want to treat all my low biomass areas the same. So I'm not going to use this, right? It's a very accurate map. This is the yield potential, but yield potential and fertility response are two different things. So is that how you want to make zones? If I send my staff out to sample a field and this is how the zone map comes back, that they're going to put the top of the hill with this depression, they won't do it, right? They got university degrees and diplomas. They'll just say those two things don't even relate. Okay? That's how you want to make zones for fertility. That's what you soil test right there. Just another quick example. This is 2 half sections around my hometown in Acom. So here's the SWAT map. Here's some satellite imagery. So we've got these dark green saline areas here. All this land has saline seeps in it. The tops of these hills are recharges of water, and it punches out all these side hills. All the farmers have seen this, even especially in wet years. You got water coming out of side hills everywhere. On the satellite image, you can see it's brown. It's low biomass, and these areas are all very high fertility. Doesn't grow good, and it's always just loaded with everything. They don't need fertilizer. Conversely, we got water shedding areas here. They're red on our map. Low biomass again, right? But these areas, they have nothing for fertility. It's been 10 years it's been wet in the area that I've worked, and we've been pumping on nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur hard on these areas, and they've been growing some of our best crops. They're low fertility areas. If you get water, they need lots of fertilizer. You don't treat them the same. Now, just in the corner of this map here, on this side, zoom in, and this is all showing that it's low to medium biomass. It doesn't show up good on the slide here, but this whole area was infested with slugs, and they just peeled the leaves right off of it. So why I use this example is you've got salinity, tops of hills, and insect pressure, all showing low biomass. Well, it's all correct, right? And it was all, that's how the thing yielded. But you don't treat them all the same when you're going to go put on fertilizer, right? They don't relate to fertilizer. So just in summary of that section there, what should soil, water, and topography maps used for? I mean, these are soil potential maps. They don't change. The field doesn't change. The weather might change, but the field never changes. This is what you soil sample. Okay? You want to do moisture monitoring? Well, this is obviously what you do. For variable rate fertilizer and seed, this is your map. Anything in the soil. These maps are very useful too. We use them, but they're very unstable. Like they change related to everything. 100 different factors affect the yield potential every year, and it doesn't relate straight back to fertility. So variable rate fungicides, desiccants, establishing what yield potentials are, or applying inputs in crop. That's the difference between these two forms of injury. So now I'm just going to skip out of that now. So that was making zones, okay? I wanted to spend the most time on that. How do you make zones? Areas grouped together must have similar fertilizer response characteristics. I think I've established that. Okay? Now I'm just going to do just a little quick example in this field of what we do with variable rate fertilizer and seed. So we go out and soil test it. Like I said, we turn 10 zones into 5. This is for price, amount of time it takes, and just the resolution. We don't need all 10. So we take the extreme on each end. So for example, in these hills here, there's 5 ones here. You drive to that with the truck and you'd punch several holes in each one and put that in a bag, and that's your zone 1 sample. All your hills are sampled together as one. Same thing with your salinity. You'd go to those spots, sample them all together, put it in a bag. That'll define what the properties are of your salinity. Okay. We have 8 of these trucks. We do a ton of sampling. So you load up your map on here. And we have 24-inch cores. We can take whatever people want, split it off, or else we have an automatic system. And at the request of the tile drainage people, because we do a lot of surveying for people for tile drainage, because they want the EC layers and the RTK elevations to do their maps, we also have a 4-foot auger that we can collect like textures down to 3 to 4 feet where they're going to lay the tile. So just an example of the soil test from this field from last fall. So you can see here, here's my zones. This is the tops of my hills, my mid-slopes, and then down to my saline depressions. And we sampled each spot separately, so there was 5 points on there that the truck drove to. When he drove to the point, he sampled each point separately and put them in a bag. So you can see how consistent all the tops of the hills were all low in phosphorus. Here's the average. Same thing with all the shoulder slopes. So he's probably got 30–40% of his field here that tests extremely low in phosphorus. Got a couple of what I don't know, I call these like goose poop samples. This is why you do like lots of soil tests to try and take some of that stuff out, but I mean, it happens, right? That's soil testing, there's anomalies. And down here in the salinity, like I said before, very high in phosphorus. So does it pay to do variable rate phosphorus on this field? It varies a lot, doesn't it? If you're going to put on 70 pounds of product, why would you put a bunch of product down here? It isn't going to respond. You know the properties of this, and it tests high in phosphate. You might as well spend that money up here, right? Here's the sulfur test. I love the sulfur test because the most common thing people always say is, well, it doesn't work anyway. It just doesn't work. And I say, well, no, it doesn't work the way everybody does it. Because what do they sample? They sample this zone right here. They sample the mid-slope. You go out, you take the field average and look at all these variability you've got here. If you go and sample these 2 extremes, everything in the depressions is loaded with sulfur, 99.9% of the time. If you want to find low sulfur, it's up here. It's in water shedding areas with low organic matter. It isn't down there. So we go and soil test soil test 10,000 acres of your farm or something and say you don't need any sulfur, and I bet you 30–40% of it's deficient in sulfur. So this is just an example of a fertilizer prescription. I don't have sulfur on here. This was just a wheat example. So I've got urea here. And just because I got 10 zones doesn't mean I have to treat them all different. This particular year, he's putting 240 pounds of urea in all top five zones and cutting it back to 1/3 rate down in his salinity. This phosphorus I showed was really deficient, right? And all the tops of the hills and stuff. So here's got a little bit of potash in his blend, cranking on phosphorus up there, cutting it way back here. Seed, I picked the example of wheat. So in wheat, fusarium's a big problem in our area. So targeting plant stands of 30 plants per square foot has become what we've done. And the main reason is we don't want a lot of tillering. Okay, we want most of our heads in this early flowering stage when you come to spray. If you have 15 plants per square foot, you'll have like all 3 of these stages of heads on one plant, right? And that's not what you want. You don't want to condense your heading. And the other issue is that no one ever talks about, but I've been an agronomist for 21 years now, and the number one problem with the variability in the field is you go out to the field and tops of the hills or the water shedding areas look like this. You go down to the depressions and they look like this. Okay, so not only do you have this sort of within plant variability, there's lots of variability within the field. I don't think that there's more than 25–30% of the heads out in the field in the right stage when you go to spray due to field variability. No one talks about this because no one goes and looks at it and records all the information. So in 2012, there's no research on this. There's nothing, and no one knows what to do. So we said, well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to go out and count plants. So we just went out to all our customers' fields. We went to the tops of the hills, counted their plant stands. We went to their mid-slopes and counted their plant stands, and we went to their depressions. And what we found was the mid-slopes always had the best establishment, 20 plants per square foot. The hills dropped off a bit, and the depressions dropped off a lot. But we also realized we were nowhere near 30 plants, right? So most people always say that they're doing something. We're seeding for 30 plants. I hear it all the time, and I'm like, have you gone out and checked? Do you actually count the plants and you know your numbers? Because I bet you don't have 30 plants. Why is that? Well, here's a few of the reasons. It can be hard and lumpy on tops of those hills. Because it's a little bit harder, it can be a little bit shallower seeding, and it's the first thing to dry out. These areas, almost everyone everyone tells us to seed early, but when you do seed early, you're often mudding it in. In those areas, after it dries out, it turns to concrete. It can be deeper seeding. This is volunteer canola growing on a field. The cutworms have got all the volunteer canola cleaned off on all the hills. All the mid-slopes have awesome volunteer canola growing. You can see here down in this run, it's almost still black. It's cold, it's wet, the volunteer canola isn't growing. I'm here to make a spray recommendation, and we're going to spray this out and seed wheat in a couple days. And so that's what you seed into, right? These are when volunteer canola is gone, I seed wheat into this, then the cutworms are chewing on my wheat here, and the wheat's still in the cold, wet soil, and it's growing slow. Those are the factors that we're dealing with. So based on the plant stand counts that we did and our observations, you increased seeding rate a little bit in those hills, put the standard rate in the mid-slopes, and then increased it as much as you could without plugging his drill. Then it doesn't cost a lot to do variable rate seed. He was going to put on 150 pounds anyway, and we averaged out at 155 because those areas are pretty small. This is just a shot of the field coming up. So one thing that's important is from this presentation is I'm giving you an example of one field, right? So I'm not transplanting this knowledge to say from southern Manitoba to up in Binscarth and Russell, and at this example of Wadena, I'm doing all the same thing, right? Every little area you move into it's a little bit different. But I'm just trying to show you that a lot of the stuff I'm showing you here isn't like related to data collection. It's related to field observations, it's related to field scouting, it's related to getting the right zone maps in relation to the field. So you can see this crop coming up here, and I mean, we have the right strategy. But this farmer's been with us for 10 years, okay? Now this is his, we've gone out and scouted his wheat now, and we've counted his plants after he's implemented his program. 30 plants, 31, 29, 30, 22. So this is the tops of his hills to his mid-slopes down to these saline depressions. So we've got his field averaged out at 30. Okay, and if I go back to the prescription, also in this land is urea. Remember, I was cutting back as I went down the slopes. So what we've found in this particular land, that if we do that, we take away the hills maturing faster than the depressions. We cut our nitrogen a lot in these high organic matter, wet depressions that are coming up later when it's fusarium spraying time. Okay, sorry, I'll show this first. Yeah, so this is the plant stand counts in general, what we found after we did our VR. This was all those same clients. So we still never hit 30 plants. It's amazing how hard it is to, once you start increasing your seeding rates, to try and hit higher plant stands. It's just the emergence rate drops off quite a bit. But we pretty much averaged it out to be quite a bit more consistent. And this was 2016. And the only reason I'm showing this is just to say we do it every year. Right? You just keep learning. And it's, although this is generalized, every farmer gets that sheet of paper that shows you what's going on in your field so you can gauge what it is and do your planning from it. So that's 30 plants per square foot in this guy's wheat field. There's not a lot of tillering in this wheat. It's all in a very consistent stage. And from hills to depressions, it's consistent. When we go and spray for fusarium, we got a lot of heads in the right stage. And when it comes to harvest a crop like this, if it was more even at this time, guess what happens at harvest time? It's more even, right? So a lot of our seed growers especially, the number one question people usually ask us is, well, how much yield are you going to give me? I'm like, well, it depends on what your goals are. Like, what if all I could give you this year was less fusarium? Would that have value to you? What if I lost a bushel of wheat just so I could try doing this? You know, I don't think we're asking the right questions. If it's all about yield, sometimes I think you're missing the boat. Straight cutting is a big thing. Seed growers, I mean, they want nice even crops. They don't want green patches everywhere and stuff. They want that stuff off and in the bin. They can't spray it with Roundup. So it's really important to them. So just to summarize here, this is my last slide. We can't ignore soils. I wrote this article and put it on LinkedIn a year and a half ago, and it's got over 6,000 viewers now and a huge conversation going globally with other soil professionals. 95% of the world wants to do what's easy. It's related to satellite imagery. It's related to yield data collection. Collecting information on soils is hard. And as you can see, we're trying to scale that. We're trying to make it easier to collect more acres of information so that people can have access to this. But if you leave this out, I don't think it's going to work. Hence my title, Making It Great Again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Corey. We do have a few minutes for questions, so if you're willing to entertain a couple,
You
then
betcha.
yeah. Has anybody got a question? Nobody? Oh, there's one up there. Do you want a microphone? Okay.
Do you have to prep your field at all for the SWAT box? No. Don't have to do anything. It'll go through layers of straw. It'll go through anything. There's snow, frost, water. Yeah, it's just be mounted to equipment or a truck or UTV or anything. And I don't know how far off the ground it would be. Is Derek here? No, he's at the booth, I guess. Yeah, 16 inches off the ground roughly. Any other questions? Up there?
Corey, could you just repeat the question, please?
Yeah. What was the range of seeding rates to get the plants down in the example there? In that example, it was 180 pounds on the tops of the hills, 150 in all the mid slopes, and 180 in the depressions. Yeah. And generally what we're running into is you can't get enough seed on with most drills without plugging them in those depressions. If you want to hit 30 plants, it's basically impossible. Well, how did we arrive at them? Well, we used the 1,000 kernel weight. So we did the 1,000 kernel weight, get the germ, get the target plants down, estimate the mortality, which in this field it was like 15%. And that's how we arrived at the seeding rate of 150 pounds here. So 150 would have given him his target plants down. And because there's higher mortality on that hill versus that saline depression is why we have to increase it there to address that mortality. Anything else?
Any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank you, Corey, for spending some time with us here this afternoon. We have a small token of appreciation here for you on behalf of the Manitoba Ag Days Committee. So thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast. We'll see you next year from January 22nd to 24th, 2019.